So first of all, we're delighted to have Martin Redfern here. He's actually worked, as he was just saying, for the BBC now for about 30 years. Originally had some time in television, but then saw the light and moved over to radio. And indeed has been working now for the BBC Radio Science Unit for most of the past 25 years. And has also been doing a lot of broadcasting in the BBC Overseas World Programmes. So his science programmes have been going out week after week over that time. I'm sure many of us have listened to them with enjoyment and indeed education. I think radio is immensely educational. You can really grapple with issues and get into issues in some depth. Martin's also been involved in these Templeton Cambridge fellowships in science and religion for people from the media, and indeed has been involved in that now for 2 summers. They've been held here in Cambridge, and indeed I think that's where we first met, in that context where people from the world of media are brought here to Cambridge for several weeks and hear a whole series of people giving talks on science, religion and so forth. And the whole aim of that is to actually help people who are out there in the media to understand the issues and to then relate them back in their own particular context. Also, Martin recently has been getting involved in popular science books. The latest of these is The Earth, a very short introduction, published by OUP in 2003. So we're very pleased that Martin has taken time to come along, and he's going to tell us about radio and the whole involvement of science and faith in the way that those issues are handled in radio. So thanks very much, Martin.
Well, thank you, Dennis. I feel very honoured to be here. As Claire says, I'm normally up against the coalface, broadcasting in the case of Radio 4 to a few 100,000 people at a time. In the case of World Service to a global audience of, they claim it's 163 million, though I think it's only about 20 million that listen to any one programme. But I assure you that a room full of real people is far more daunting, and I'm far less experienced at that. Also, if we're broadcasting live on the radio, we have an engineer who will look after the sound effects and so on, and we have a producer who will make sure that the programme runs to time. Perhaps Dennis will throw things at me in the producer role. You'll have to bear with me being my own engineer, because I'm going to play you a few sound clips. So jump up and down and wave if you can't hear them or being deafened. I guess every good event starts with a confession, and I must confess that I am specifically a science journalist. I'm not a religion journalist. My interest in religion is purely personal, and all the various candid, cynical comments that I might raise on issues are my own and not those of the BBC, so I say that for video. And any lawyers who happen to be watching. And in fact, my first admission is that I don't actually really like the word religion. I know it's used for this course. I know the Templeton Foundation use it for practically everything they fund. I wish that they wouldn't use that word, which for me relates it to specific dogmas which you have to believe or you're not part of that club. I wish they'd just use the word spirituality, which I can relate to much more happily. But first rant done. I think there is a tendency, well, there's certainly a tendency historically, as I'll say in a moment, in science and religion for a duality and possibly no joining up between the two. There's also a tendency in broadcasting and journalism in general to portray everything as a duality, to want someone with the opposite viewpoint, as we've already heard. I think we've grown up beyond needing a denial person on global warming issues nowadays, but certainly some of my colleagues still. I think we've grown out of actually needing a denial person on evolution stories, but there are still stories where nothing like a good punch-up. So, well, how about this for a dualistic opening to a programme? This is from a series I made 3 years ago called Sacred Showdown.
For centuries, science and religion have scarcely been on speaking terms. People have been burnt at the stake, imprisoned, ridiculed and condemned for holding scientific views that were contrary to the religious beliefs of their time. Among scientists today, there's as wide a range of views as ever.
It really is very difficult to be a scientist of any profundity without being moved by the enormous beauty and complexity of the natural world, and to really have a sense of the sacred.
There's no reason why a scientist can't also be a believer, and people will come to listen to me say that just because I'm a Nobel laureate.
Religion is a gigantic waste of time. It can be positively evil. The world would be a very much better place if religion didn't exist.
There are some serious tensions that need to be resolved, and it's going to be changes on one side or the other.
So that's the tension, that's the split. Most of the rest of what I'm going to talk about is about trying to heal that split, or at least walking on the tightrope between the extremes of religious fundamentalism and materialist scientist fundamentalism, both of which I think are rather belief-based, as I shall say. I think the rot really set in with, with him, with Galileo. Well, rather than explain, you know the story, I'm sure, but another sound clip to summarise it. This is Dr. Peter Fenwick, who's a neuropsychiatrist and president of the Scientific and Medical Network.
Galileo argued that the world had two qualities. The primary qualities, which were mass, matter, and energy, and the secondary qualities, which were things like truth, love, and so on. He said that science was concerned only with primary qualities. The other major factor at that time was Descartes, who essentially said the same thing. He talked about the res extensa, the extended thing of the body, and the other was the res cogitans, or the knowing thing. What he did, in fact, is he gave the res cogitans, or the soul, to the church, and he gave the res extensa to science. And so there was high politics behind this.
And in a sense, religion, well, science more so, has been living with the legacy of that ever since. It was originally to give scientists a bit of safe ground to work on without the Inquisition coming knocking on the door, but it's meant that there have been no-go areas for science ever since. And whilst science has become supremely successful and through technology all-powerful, so it has rather assumed the dominant role in our society today, I think, with the white-coated priests of science in their laboratories, in their ivory towers, having some things in common perhaps with the Grand Inquisitors of Galileo's time. The American writer Dorothy Nelkin described the science journalist as the true descendant of Prometheus, who takes the fire of science down from the ivory towers of the laboratories and brings it to the people. I think that's a load of rot, because I think actually scientists are people too, but it's a nice quote to throw in. But the legacy of all that, is that we've got what Stephen Jay Gould rather pompously described as non-overlapping magisteria. We have two completely different worlds, not even touching, let alone overlapping each other. And, well, I think there's something wrong with that, because they're both worlds that we live in. So you can get that dualism in a person, and actually, I hate to say it, but quite a few of the people who come to give talks on science and religion I suspect have that duality in their lives, in that they'll talk very eloquently about science, they'll talk very eloquently about their religious beliefs, but when you ask them questions across the divide between the two, they somehow are very good at changing the subject. It's my experience that there are exceptions, though, some of whom are present today, which is very refreshing. Both science and religion in themselves, I think, have also become very dualistic. There's the thought of God and the world as being two entirely separate, disconnected things. And that's something which is really picked up by science, even scientists who are trying to find a role for God in the world. If they're doing so dualistically, he ends up being a god of the gaps. Okay, we can't explain thunder, it must be Thor. Fine. No, we've got an explanation for thunder. Sorry about that, God. Oh well, let's take it up to date. Haven't got an explanation for the dark energy, or we haven't got an explanation for the Big Bang, or haven't got an explanation for the chemical origin of life. All of those are dangerous grounds, because those are things which we might have perfectly good explanations for before long, and if you put your stakes on God on those, you're going to ended up getting him squeezed out of the universe, and if he's very lucky, sitting on some sort of separate cloud out of time and space, and with very little to do with anything and with us. And I don't really like that, and I don't suppose God does either. So there is another view, though, which is beginning to gain more credence. I thought that was rather a nice portrayal of it. At least they're beginning to flow into one another. They're different aspects of the same, the yin and the yang. And we have to ask ourselves, if we're following Galileo and Descartes, which is actually the primary quality? Is it the external objective truth? I'm not sure if it is. What's the thing you're absolutely sure about? As Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Or I think he should have said, I'm conscious, therefore I am. It's the first person perspective which is actually the primary thing, and that's the thing which, all except a few rather woolly psychologists, scientists generally tend to exclude at the moment, but it is beginning to flow back in through, seminars such as these, for instance. And what I say about science is largely true, I think, about science journalism as well. The majority of my colleagues are quite fundamentalist, atheist, reductionist, materialist, and they're most amused by me coming to take part in seminars like this. But things are beginning to come together. That's just something to look at, but that was from the Science and the Spiritual Quest Boston conference, which I attended, and that program clip that I played at the start came from one of the programs that resulted from that. And in fact, Philip Clayton, who was the overall organizer of that, saw the fact that it was taking place in Harvard University as representing something special. Am I right in thinking that Philip Clayton's coming to Cambridge?
He's just left. He's been here the past year.
Oh right, it was just for 1 year,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Right, okay.
We are at a crucial place in the discussion between science and religion. It's a breaking wave. There's a huge momentum behind this coming together of two huge movements within our contemporary culture. Will the coming together be a clash, a sort of explosive meeting? Or will it be a coming together like the flowing together of two great rivers into a greater, more powerful body of water? With this conference, we see now that the religion science discussion has entered the mainstream. Harvard University allows this in the center of the campus. Major physicists from the university are sitting in the audience, This is no longer something done behind closed church doors or by religious sects. At the core of the scientific establishment, there's an awareness that this intersection is one that we all have to grapple with, specialist and layperson alike.
And it's interesting, he talked about one of the outcomes potentially being a clash. We recorded that interview about 3 weeks after 9/11, when it looked as if in some ways it might be. And it's interesting, if not worrying, that at the same time as there's this wonderful coming together in the middle, the edges seem to be polarizing more and more between the extreme hawkish atheists and the, or indeed fundamentalist Christians and the fundamentalists of other faiths. But there you go, there is coming together in the middle of that, I'm sure. And it was interesting that all the people we interviewed at that conference, or indeed any other gathering like that, from many different faiths, all talk about the same coming together, as it were, as if not only are the religions following different paths up the same mountain, but that mountain is also in the realm of science.
An ordinary Sunday service at a gospel church in the United States, but that bass singer you can hear holds a Nobel Prize for physics. We asked Professor Bill Phillips what a guy like him was doing in a place like that, and indeed admitting it at an international conference.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm here, is to disabuse people of the notion that somebody like a physicist doesn't belong in a church where people sing gospel songs and clap their hands and experience joy in being part of a community of faith.
Top scientists who are also religious can be found practicing every faith, not just Western Christianity. Bruno Guidardoni is research director of the Paris Institute of Astrophysics and a devout Muslim.
Knowledge is central in the Islamic tradition. The Prophet Muhammad said that the quest for knowledge is a religious duty. Religious knowledge brings us information about God, but the knowledge of the world also brings us knowledge about God, because the world has been created by God. So by looking at the cosmos, the galaxies, the stars, the planets, I am contemplating God's creation. This is my deep feeling.
Ramnath Kosik, a Hindu, runs an astrophysics institute in Bangalore in India.
The Hindu perspective on science and religion is there is no dichotomy. The early Indian tradition looked at nature, and that was the source of inspiration for exploration into the world.
Another astronomer, this time from Vietnam and working in America, is Buddhist Trinh Tuan.
Buddhism is more the inner transformation, the spiritual transformation. To me, science is just a study of phenomenon. It does not contain any intrinsic moral ethical value. Also, the methods are very, very different. But yet, we saw very, very striking convergences.
And you'll realise that although I'm talking about science and religion, what I'm really talking about is journalism covering that, because all these are examples of radio programs that we've made. So it's the sort of, I hope, balanced coverage that we give these issues. It's always, though, been a little bit of a battle. I think, for me certainly, to get some of these issues lots of airtime, there are all the major programs I do have to go past channel commissioners, and there are usually several of them in a long chain, and it's a bit like trying to shine a light through cross-polarizers. If you can get your editor interested, then she goes and represents your wonderful idea to the person who commissions, for instance, Radio 4 in the evenings, and he's not so keen on astronomy and thinks religion's a load. So, but maybe she talks him around, and then he has to go and present it in another meeting to the overall controller of Radio 4, and maybe he doesn't like it for a different reason. So it's not easy actually getting ideas through. I don't think it's quite as bad as having to write grant proposals for funding science, maybe, but given that each programme you only get a week or two to make anyway, if you spend a week pitching it, it's a bit difficult. I think in some ways religion journalists have it easier, because in the religion slots they love to hear about science as reflected in religion. That's science is definitely a growth area in religion, but I'm not sure that religion is in science, partly because a lot of my colleagues are atheist reductionists. Having said that, science is still given a reasonable amount of airtime on the radio, less so on television, whereas religion is given very little airtime at all, and it tends to end up being either broadcast services of worship of some sort, or things about the politics of religion rather than about religion itself. And I don't really care what one particular person's policy is, or even what the Pope has said in the speech. I'd much sooner hear things that are spiritually uplifting, perhaps, but perhaps that's me. But it does mean, though, that again, the dualistic thing of a discussion rhymes with concussion, goes down quite well. So yeah, we can get I think television on Sunday this week has Richard Dawkins and what's his name, McGrath, Aston McGrath, on what do they call it? The Heaven and Earth show. They're trying to go down market a bit. Don't get me started on television. But there are a number of organisations. Well, there's one organisation in particular, the Templeton Foundation, who's doing more than anyone, thanks largely to very generous funds from Sir John, to bring science and religion together, including science journalism. There was, well, Dennis mentioned that I was lucky enough to be a fellow last year, as was Michael. I'm not going to say too much about it, because I suspect you're going to say a bit more, are you?
About the fellowship?
About the fellowship when the time comes?
No.
Well, okay, well, I'll say a little bit more. I mean, that was such a luxury. 2 months off work, not just for that reason, but particularly 2 weeks with a group of just 10 of us in an old kitchen, the old kitchen in Queens, with a succession of the most wonderful speakers in a comparatively small group with plenty of time for discussion. People such as Dennis and John Horgan and John Horton and many others. That was a real luxury. But the interesting thing was that the people who got invited, both as speakers and as fellows, were not simply representing religion or the Christian viewpoint. They were from a very wide range of people. Richard Dawkins was one of them, which was quite fun. And among the fellows, this great guy called John Horgan, who afterwards wrote a great diatribe about what he called the Templeton effect, about journalists and indeed Templeton Prize winners getting large bribes, not so large in the case of the journalists, I hasten to add, to write science things with God in the title and so on. I thought that was rather sad, because the fact that he had been invited as a fellow and is an atheist, I thought was a bit like the Groucho Marx effect, only in verse. Groucho Marx said, I wouldn't want to be a member of any club that would have me as a member. I think any club that would have people like John Horgan and other atheists as members must be pretty reasonable clubs, really. So I think that rather defeated his argument. But it's done a great deal, in my opinion, to ease the dialogue and bring things together. Very quick plug for another organisation I'm involved with, much smaller and more impoverished, but what's the current strapline? The strapline changes every fortnight. Yeah, I think we've gone for a shorter one. That's off the website as it was yesterday, exploring the frontiers of science, medicine, spirituality and human experience. Very careful to avoid the word religion, and indeed hours were spent at a committee meeting arguing over whether we should put the word spirituality in the strapline. But that's another very interesting group of people who are mostly scientists and who are looking for things that fertilise between the material reductionist world and what many of us think is, there must be more to it all than that, without coming at it from the point of view of any particular dogma. So, with our now perhaps overlapping magisteria, it's not actually a case of squeezing God out of the gaps. It's perhaps a case now, some of the front lines are in finding the overlaps. This is just a random selection that occurred to me last night because I thought I needed the slide at this point. But you know the sorts of things that are entering into the debate, issues about the nature of brain and the mind. Are they the same thing? Does mind extend beyond brain, perhaps after death? What is the actual nature of consciousness? Can we ever answer the hard problem of not simply finding the neural correlates of experience, but finding experience itself? Can I ever actually know that you are conscious, or are you just behaving like very intelligent conscious machines? It's only your experience and you telling me that you have that experience that I have to go on in that, which is actually a hard problem. Plenty of consciousness researchers, just like Daniel Dennett, just brush it under the carpet and say, oh no, that's not really a problem. Somebody said that in a sense my room thermostat is conscious. It's got two states of consciousness. It's too hot in here or it's too cold in here. Somewhere along the line, I think there is experience that comes in. There is this res cogitans of Descartes. There is an inner world. And then there are actually experiments that you can do to see if mind is extended. I shall mention some controversial ones of those in a moment on telepathy. There are the experiments that have been done on the effectiveness of prayer, some of which have been less conclusive than others, I think. But that's another one that the jury's still out. That's something where good work can be done and exciting journalism can be done reporting it. Then there's mystical experiences themselves. Are they simply, again, neural correlates? Are they chemical responses between nerve cells that you can bring on with various nice drugs and perhaps meditative practices and so on? Is there something more to it there? Indeed, if it is just neurology, why is our brain wired in that way? Why is our brain wired for belief? There are issues which I'm not really going to go into this time because we've got plenty of other wonderful sessions. We had one already this morning about bioethics and morality, but that's an area obviously of a lot of overlap. And then there are a whole load of things about the universe and our place within it. Again, I will come back to some of those, assuming we've got time in a few minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about the project that I did during my fellowship, which was looking at the anthropic principle. But there are other issues there that have a bearing on religion, though I don't think the sort of spirituality that I go for, they pose any threat, like whether we are alone in the universe. for instance. Just how special are we? Does it matter that we're just in one planet round a fairly typically dull star and an outer spiral arm of a galaxy among billions? Well, actually, maybe it does, but that's another issue. So let's just touch on one or two of these. I was lucky enough to be sort of assistant co-underproducer of the Reith Lectures over a couple of years when they do science topics, and in '03 we had V.S. Ramachandran, who rolls his R's in a way that I could not emulate. And one of the things that he claims falsely credited for is discovering the God spot, which got picked up by all the newspapers. Actually, it's something that he denies.
The popular press misquoted our research. In fact, actually misquoted me as having said that there's a God center in the Temple of Love. We never said something like that. All it's telling you is that if there is activity in the limbic system, in the temporal lobe, some kinds of activity in this part of the brain seems to predispose you to religious belief. Why that is, we have no idea. It may be something as simple as the patient is going crazy, emotional upheavals, therefore seeks refuge in religion. It may be that there are circuits there which are there hardwired, put in there by your genes, specifically for religious experience, but that's highly unlikely.
And in fact, since then, of course, Dean Hamer has brought out his book called The God Gene, and he did call it The God Gene, even if Ramachandran didn't call it The God Spot, which raises interesting questions. If we are wired for belief, why? And, well, I'm not going to really answer that. We did have a programme the day before yesterday. I'm currently producing The Material World, which goes out live at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, and I'm sure you're all glued to your radios. But we had somebody this week talking about evolutionary reasons for belief in magic, superstition and religion, which was interesting. And of course Richard Dawkins talks about if it's there, it must be there for a reason. He draws the analogy of cranes and skyhooks, with things like evolution. That, he says, is built by a crane, it's founded on the ground, whereas if something is appearing from some mystical, magical, divine reason, then you're invoking skyhooks, you're invoking something you can't explain to haul it up. But another interesting issue which comes up frequently. But the most fundamental thing we all have is personal experience, and some of those experiences can be mystical. Andrew Newberg in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia Hospital has done these brain scans of meditating Tibetan monks and indeed praying Christian nuns.
It's a meditative state of Buddhist monk, how they can abstract their mind and fuse with the nature around them, the cosmos around them. If we can know our mind, we can control our emotions, and I think that feelings of hate, anger and desire of materialism, all these things, of course, can go away, and that I think certainly would make the world better.
We invited a number of Tibetan Buddhist meditators to come into our laboratory. We brought them into our lab and got them all set up. We started out by putting a very small intravenous catheter or a little tube into their arm so that we could inject a small amount of a radioactive material that actually was used to measure the blood flow in the brain during different states. We obtained a brain image when the person was just in their normal waking state, and then we actually had them go through a fairly intense meditation session that usually lasted about an hour or so, at which point we had worked out a little signal with them, which essentially consisted of them pulling on a string that was situated right by their side. So when we saw that little piece of string wiggle, that was the time for us to begin the injection of our radioactive tracer again so that we could obtain a scan during their meditation state. We were then able to compare the meditation state to their normal waking state and see what areas were activated and which areas were inactivated during the meditation. There were actually a number of differences that we saw, and I think two of the most important ones were an increase in activity in the front part of the brain. That's the part of the brain right behind the forehead. We know that this is an area that is activated whenever somebody focuses their attention on a particular task. And we certainly know that meditation is a highly intense focusing of the self on a particular object, or in the case of the Tibetan Buddhists, on a visualized object that they created in their own mind. The other area that we were very interested in was an area located towards the back top part of the brain that technically is called the parietal lobe, and we've sometimes referred to that as the orientation area. This is an area that takes a lot of our sensory information and essentially puts together a sense of the self and helps us to orient that self through time and space. One of the things that changes very dramatically in meditation is that people have a loss of the sense of self, and frequently they experience a sense of spacelessness, of no space or no time. And that's exactly what we saw. We saw relative decreases in the activity in that area. And interestingly, the more they activated that front part of the brain, that attention area, the more they tended to decrease the activity in that orientation part of the brain.
It's very easy from that sort of study to go down the route of what I call a nothing butterer. You can say that the experience is nothing but such and such a pattern in the brain, or such a firing of nerve cells and so on. But I don't find that very satisfying. Actually, I'm pleased to say, nor does Andrew Newberg.
When someone has a mystical experience, they perceive that sense of reality to be far greater and far clearer than our usual everyday sense of reality. And when we look at it from that perspective, since the sense of the spiritual reality is more powerful and more clear, then perhaps that sense of reality is more accurate, one could argue, than our scientific sense of reality and our everyday sense of reality. In our work, we really look to find a way of integrating the scientific and spiritual perspectives, because I think one without the other is going to miss some very important pieces of information. If we're just scientific, we'll write off the concepts of spirituality and God, and we'll miss what spirituality and religion do bring to us as human beings. But on the other hand, if we're just religious and we ignore science, then we're also going to miss some very important parts of who we are and how we work and how we understand our place in the world.
Yeah. I think I'm going to go on past this. This is a sequence about near-death experiences. I'm sure you're all familiar with the literature on this, and that it seems to be, it seems to relate to something which can't be explained simply by the lack of oxygen in the brain and the confusional state. Very interesting, and again, first-hand experiences. I'm also going to go through this because we had such a good description of the sorts of things in the moral maze. We do another occasional series called Inside the Ethics Committee, which is, I expect you've heard some of them, have you? Yeah, similar sort of scenario, except it's not a live panel, it's actually people who really were on the ethics committee looking at that particular case, but similar issues with finding the right case and so on. I will just play this though, because not all coverage of ethical issues is quite so unbiased. I'm not quite sure that this web page relates to the programme that I'm concerned that I'm going to play you a little clip of, but it might do. This is of course television, for which I take no responsibility. And you know, it made some interesting points, but I feel it's an example of how music and sound effects and narration can perhaps rather bias your reaction.
In Nazi Germany, tens of thousands of mentally and physically disabled people were killed. This was carried out by doctors. It was a drastic form of eugenics, a desire to improve the race by eliminating genetic defects. It seems unthinkable that we could return to this through modern genetic medicine.
I think there is already new eugenics going on. Look and we say one thing is good, one thing is bad, and the bad thing has to be eliminated.
We're having an effect beyond what I would have liked to occur.
Many people go into medicine because they don't like illness. They don't like illness in themselves, and they don't like illness in others.
The 20th century was the century of Freud. I think the 21st century is going to be the century of the gene.
A bit hammed up, I would say, and a little unnecessarily emotive, but hey. So, back to radio, back to the sane world of radio, and we have telepathy. This is a much more recent example. This was a fortnight ago up the road at University of East Anglia and the British Association Science Festival. And I knew that this was going to be highly controversial. We got together, well, Rupert Sheldrake has this reputation, partly because his first book, which he only ever meant as a speculative book about the possibility of fields other than the electromagnetic one, linking us all together in some way, very speculative and probably wrong, but it got reviewed as the best candidate for a book for burning that the editor of Nature had read for many years. So instantly the sales went up, but his academic credibility went down, and he's done some fairly inconclusive studies on psychic pets and things like that. But he is doing some, what I think is some very intriguing work on telepathy now, which does seem to be building up some really good data. So I thought, okay, let's take him out to a session that, along with a skeptic, well, as you see there, that was our little discussion panel, and we broadcast the result on Radio 4 fortnight ago last Thursday. I'll just play you a tiny little clip from it.
Do you want me to explain how the experiments work?
You know I might, yes.
Okay.
You could have guessed. Oh, red mum now.
The subjects name 4 people they might be telepathic with, typically people they're close to, family members or friends. Then they sit with a landline telephone, no caller ID, being filmed at home usually. We pick one of the callers at random, throw the dice, and ring that person up, ask them to call them. When the phone rings, they have to guess who it is before they pick up the receiver by saying to the camera who it is. By pure guessing, they'd be right about 1 time in 4, 25%. In these film trials, they're right 45% of the time, and this is massively significant statistically with hundreds of trials. So the evidence points to this being a real phenomenon. We've done a very similar set of experiments with emails. For emailers, can you guess who's about to send you an email? The success rate there is about 47% compared with 25% by chance.
Chris French, what's going on, in your opinion?
In my opinion, something interesting is going on. It's a question of whether anything paranormal is going on. I mean, I think Deborah's quite right in saying that in general terms, the kinds of effects that people get seem to be very, very small effects. And one of the techniques which has been used to try and establish whether there really is something going on or isn't is something called meta-analysis, which involves taking data from dozens and dozens, sometimes hundreds of different studies, putting them all into one big analysis and trying to decide on that basis, is there actually something going on? And surprise, surprise, different results come from different meta-analyses, even when you're trying to ask essentially the same question. One of the things that intrigues me about Rupert's research is that we're not dealing with small effects. We're actually dealing with pretty large effects, 25% mean chance expectation, but Rupert seems to get results in his telephone telepathy experiments consistently above 40%. Now, one of the things that intrigues me about this is, why aren't there dozens and dozens of parapsychologists replicating Rupert's effects? I would have thought here is an example where there is an apparently very strong, robust effect. And I'd really like to throw this one over to Deborah to say, why aren't there dozens and dozens of parapsychologists who are actually replicating these effects? I confess I have tried to replicate several of the effects that Rupert's reported. I don't tend to get positive results. My students don't tend to get positive results. Maybe that's because I'm a nasty, horrible skeptic and I don't believe in it in the first place. I don't know.
But certainly there are plenty of nasty, horrible skeptics around, and I thought that was quite a balanced discussion. I mean, you've only heard a bit of it there, but there was more of similar sort of nature for a half-hour programme. It was picked up all over the place. That was from an AOL news site that actually put voting buttons, something I wanted to do for Radio 4, but they couldn't organise the technology. And as you see, 62% of those polled believed in telephone telepathy. I don't think I would state it quite as hard as that. Because belief is a word that doesn't come very easily to me. I just hope. And 85% had an anecdotal experience of what might be that. But what surprised me was the response that we got in the broadsheet newspapers. We had a press conference where they were asking a few, not as hostile as I'd expected, questions. They didn't come to the session or ask for copies of the paper. But I did notice them getting on the phone to one or two of their friends like Peter Atkins and other well-known atheists. And the next day we had headlines like this: Festival attacked over paranormal nonsense. Theories of telepathy and afterlife cause uproar at Science Forum. Well, actually the session had been very reasonable. There wasn't an uproar, and the votes went rather the same sort of way with the 150 people in the lecture theatre, rather the same way as in that online vote I just showed you. There certainly wasn't an uproar. These journalists had actually created the uproar by phoning people who they knew would be offended that Sheldrake was allowed to speak at the BA, and got them to give quotes to that effect, having not attended the session, having not read the papers. And for me, having a rant, I know, but for me that is an example of journalism led by belief. Leave you to draw your own conclusions. It was rather interesting, though. There was a discussion the next day on BBC 5 Live with Sheldrake and Peter Atkins both on the phone, where Peter Atkins was saying, "Oh, it's just statistically insignificant, it's not a proper effect." Which Rupert said, so what's wrong with the statistics? Have you actually read the paper? Oh, I don't need to read the paper, it's just rubbish. And he admitted that he hadn't actually looked at the paper or the statistics. So I think we're not entirely up against rationality there. Not that I say we should be up against anything. I think it's an interesting discussion worthy of more research, but it's the sort of one-sidedness one gets. Now, that's the first half. I've got 5 minutes left for the second half. I knew I wouldn't have long. It's the filler, but I'm just going to have to change PowerPoints for that. I'm just going to give you a little taste of a bit of cosmology. This is just a few edited highlights from the project I did with the Templeton Foundation last year on the anthropic principle. I hesitate to go any further, not least that there's an excellent book by Rodney on the table at the back about this very subject, which is clearly far more scholarly than anything you'll ever get from a journalist. Yeah, I'll just give you a few highlights of that. I think it's valid to talk about it as journalism because more or less as I wrote it for Templeton, it was turned into a 55-minute long programme for ABC Radio National in Australia, interestingly. So where's my script for that? Yeah, so the story really began in 1974 when Brandon Carter at the Paris Observatory named this thing the anthropic principle.
The very fact that we are here places restrictions on what the universe can look like.
So it might seem obvious that there wouldn't be a universe that only contained a bland cloud of hydrogen gas, or one populated entirely by black holes, because we wouldn't be there to observe it. But that actually it turns out to have become highly significant to philosophy, theology, and most recently cosmology.
The laws of physics are almost fine-tuned to encourage matter and energy to develop along certain pathways of evolution, leading to greater and greater complexity and ultimately to consciousness. One is trying to answer Einstein's famous question, did God have any choice in the creation of the world?
In so many ways, the universe is made with unusual characteristics that are exactly the ones to make thoughtful life possible.
An old-fashioned theologian might have had no difficulty with such statements. He'd start from the dogma that the universe was the creation of God and that humans were central to it, the pinnacle of creation, if you like. But that doesn't satisfy the scientific mind. Copernicus removed our planet from the centre of the universe, and we now think it's just one among billions of planets around billions of stars in billions of galaxies. Life may be common and probably has billions of years of evolution ahead of it, here or out there, leading to advances we can barely imagine. But today, science dares to ask not only what and how questions, but why questions, such as why, like Baby Bear's porridge, is our universe just right for life? Why do we live in a Goldilocks universe? Is there some deep reason why it has to be this way? Or is our view somehow biased from a range of possibilities by our very presence within it? That's what Brandon Carter called anthropic selection. And in fact, that's just the weakest of a whole range of 4 different anthropic statements.
The idea that we should condition all our predictions on the assumption that we are here to ask the question is called the weak anthropic principle.
Where the strong disagreement begins is over the question of whether the universe actually had to bring mankind into existence.
We are participators in bringing into being not only the near and here, but the far away and long ago.
At the end of time, life will have spread throughout space, it will have gained control of all matter and all forces, and it will have acquired all the knowledge that there is to know.
So that's a very brief summary. Most cosmologists will go along with the first flavour of it, that, hey, it's a pretty remarkable thing that we're here at all. And they will then say that, well, the reason that we're here at all has to be that there's an infinite number of universes, so of course we happen to inhabit the one that's just right for us. Douglas Adams compares it to what he calls puddle theory, where after it rains there's a puddle of water, saying, why should it be that that just happens to be a hole in the ground exactly the same shape as I am, and sits there marvelling at it until he evaporates. But that doesn't satisfy everybody, and then there are these other flavours of anthropic principle which I haven't got time to go into in any more significant detail, but let me just pick up on the third one of them, the participatory anthropic principle, which very few people go along with at the moment, but which I do rather like, formulated by John Wheeler, who must be in his 90s now, I guess. And he is a quantum physicist, one of the best quantum physicists, who is very interested in the role that the observer plays in the universe, and how actually by observing any phenomenon, at least at the quantum level, we in some sense bring it into being from a sort of unmanifest state. And from that he speculates that if you can have it happening with a photon coming from a laboratory bench, you can have it happening with a photon coming from the opposite side of the universe. So in a very real sense, by observing the stars and galaxies, we are bringing the universe into being. Controversial one, but an interesting one. I'm going to have to jump on several slides at this point, or I really won't have time. But yes, the universe written on a t-shirt. One more to go. You don't think that, let's just start the sound again on that. This is, so I put John Wheeler's ideas to Martin Rees, who's now the president of the Royal Society and a very respected cosmologist, who incidentally says he does go to church, but because he likes the music and the ceremony. But I thought his answer, and little conversation we had was very interesting when I asked him to comment on the participatory anthropic principle.
I don't have any views on that at all.
You don't think that we are participatory in the universe in that sense?
Well, we clearly are in a sense, but whether this relates to the fundamental quantum theory, whether indeed consciousness or awareness relates to quantum theory, I don't know.
Do you think the universe has any sort of purpose?
I wouldn't expect a human brain like mine to understand that question.
So
I certainly don't understand that question, and I really query those who claim to.
Including theologians?
I really find it hard to get on their wavelength, because if science teaches me anything, it teaches me that even simple things like atoms are fairly hard to understand. And I think there are many scientific problems that may be beyond human brains, and I certainly wouldn't expect to have anything more than a very crude, incomplete metaphorical understanding of any deep aspect of reality. And so I'm very unsympathetic to people who claim flip and easy answers to these things and claim any dogma. So I think I can share the mystery and wonder with religious people, but I don't think one should be anthropocentric enough to believe that human brains are attuned to the ultimate level of reality, and therefore I don't think we should expect to be able to understand these questions.
Another 1 minute 50 seconds, which will just nicely bring it to a conclusion. Interesting that I would actually want to give the last word to a theologian, to Keith Ward, who I also interviewed for this project. I've actually, in a sense, biased this presentation myself, because I've led it round to what I'd like to believe. It's not what I believe, because don't forget I'm a sceptical scientist as well, so I find actually the word belief a very hard word to cope with, just as I do the word religion. But at least it's what I hope, and it's best summed up by Keith Ward.
Most theologians I know now are what they call themselves panentheists, and a panentheist, because they don't like the word pantheist, is someone who thinks that the world exists within God. It's even a quotation from Acts, the book of Acts. All things live and move and have their being in God. And of course that's also been an Indian Hindu belief for a long time. I think we're all agreed, in theology we're all agreed that you have to get rid of an anthropomorphic God, one who is like a human person but outside the universe. You certainly have to get rid of that. But you can still talk about a cosmic mind or the intelligence of the universe. And in the Indian tradition that would be called Sat Chit Ananda, quite widely, being, consciousness and bliss, a consciousness of intelligence and bliss. That's exactly what I think the sort of God that science would suggest. The sort of religious view which is very compatible with modern science is a vast cosmic evolution of the finite towards the infinite. The growth of consciousness from the unconscious, the growth of intelligence from that which has no intelligence. So that indeed it seems to make sense, if you're looking at it in the most broad terms, to see the universe as a finite reflection of the intelligence of ultimate mind. A reflection which becomes one with its source.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, from that multimedia presentation. Should have stayed in television. Good, so it's open now to discussion and questions, and who wants to be the first person? Ask questions. Yes, all right.
I have a bit of a problem with what you've just been speaking about, because the problem is that I can't quite work out what you're trying to say.
On the anthropic principle.
No, I don't mean about the anthropic principle, I mean about the subject itself, because what I've understood, it could be that I'm a bit tired and haven't understood what you're saying, but it seems to me that you've been describing a whole lot of episodes of particular programs. I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say about the theme of science and religion and radio, apart from episodic sort of examples of it. Are you wanting to say something about the medium that the radio is for discussion of science and religion, issues that might be better, more profound, more wide-ranging, or have something to say compared with the medium of television, for example.
Right, yeah, I haven't really specifically talked about the nuts and bolts of radio because I thought you'd probably be more interested in the sorts of issues that I perceived, and in a sense how we tackle them was subliminal because I was using examples which might speak for themselves. I mean, I made that one comparison with television where I think, as it often does, television was pandering to sensationalism a bit, because it feels it needs to get audience, perhaps, I don't know. I think you can often get a much higher information content on radio than you can on television. I think it's also a very much more personal medium, so you can share an experience. One of the clips I didn't play on near-death experiences, for example, was a montage of people talking about their own near-death experiences, and it's actually a very personally revealing and beautiful thing, which is something I think you can do on radio, because very often it's as if you are talking to one person. We hope there are a few more there, but you were saying, weren't you, that you did a program as if you were speaking to one person, and that is very much what it is. It's very often people who are on their own, either in their cars or in their homes, who are listening. And I think you're in a very special place, being able to speak to hundreds of thousands of people in that way. And I think because of that, you can expect that they'll make a little bit more effort to listen and understand. You want to wake them up occasionally if they're not, if they're drifting off. You do want to just, we don't by and large just do the straight scripted talk for half an hour that they used to do in the 1930s or whatever. But you can be a bit more thought stimulating perhaps than you can on television. The disadvantage that you have over print, of course, is that it's very, very linear. You can't say, I didn't quite understand that last sentence, I'd like to read it again, or the phone rang, I want to listen to that bit again. Actually, of course, now you can, because all our programs go on Listen Again on the internet or on podcasts, and we have a huge and growing listenership that way as well, which is interesting. And, just for illustration, I've been putting up websites on my slides, which is another thing that, I think a lot of people go for. The Scientific and Medical Network website, which posted the full audio of those telepathy discussions. When BBC just broadcast the programme that was made at the end, we did the whole presentations on that and put a link from the BBC site to that. It got 40,000 hits in the 3 hours after the broadcast, which is more than it normally gets in 4 years. I don't know whether that answers your question, but it's a bit...
I was going to ask a similar sort of question, Martin. You made a reference to the people up the line from you being uninterested or even possibly hostile to programs about religion or science and religion. I'm not quite sure about. Is it indiscreet to ask you a bit more about that? Is the climate within the decision-making structure of the BBC rather uncomfortable with those sorts of questions? And how does that link up with any audience participation or audience response? You've just given quite substantial numbers for that telepathy, and you must now have new methods of measuring the people who choose to listen to your programs rather than the people who are approached by the old-fashioned assessment methods. And I just wondered how the audience response ties up with the decision-making structure.
Yes, I may have been being a little unfair on the BBC, because what I was talking about the difficulty of getting a proposal through the commissioners applies to any proposal. I don't think it's particular bias against against religion. There is a feeling there, or at least the feedback that we get from the commissioning process is very often, it's usually only a one-liner. They're obliged to give some sort of feedback, but it's sometimes, I don't think this sounds very interesting, or this sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah.
It's usually one or the other. You know, if it sounds vaguely familiar, they don't do it because there's been a 5-minute item in Woman's Hour 2 years ago on the same subject we want to do a 4-part series on. Therefore, we've done that. If nobody's done it before, then it's a bit too obscure. So you get caught between the devil and the deep blue sea on that. But no, I don't think in that process there's a particular bias against doing. I mean, all the things I'm doing are science programs, but science programs about aspects of religion.
Yeah.
In fact, I have a 3-part series on neurotheology coming up around about Christmas on
Okay.
service. Having said that, though, I suspect that our science unit is very much like a typical university, or perhaps a failed university science department, in that everybody's from a science background and they're the normal spectrum of human beings, of whom the slightly majority who are sort of fairly outspoken atheists carry quite a lot of weight, and the sort of group feeling is ha 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 religion, the sort of people who would tend to take the Dawkins line rather than the Keith Ward line. The sort of gung-ho feeling is that science is right, and I'm regarded as a little bit of an oddity in the unit, I think, in that I'm even interested in these things. But I think that's human nature. I think you've probably found that in many areas where you've worked, haven't you?
Yes, but I mean, the BBC is a public institution funded by public money, and it does seem to me that it should not just reflect the biases and prejudices of the people in the management team.
No, I don't think. I mean, that, as I say, I think that's more from my colleagues than from the commissioning process and so on. And the impression that one gets, in terms of direct feedback, is that the audience love it.
Yes. Well.
Yes.
All the science programs I've had has always been on BBC Radio 4, and they've always been fairly well thought out arguments, normally from academics. Is there ever any attempt within the BBC to maybe widen the audience that listen to science programs, such as doing something on popular science, or say BBC One or something, or a different radio channel? Or is everything always Radio 4? And
we can only put programs on channels that take them from us. I mean, well, we're not a television department. So,
but in terms of radio?
But in terms of radio, yeah, well, I know it's going in the opposite direction from what you're saying. We used to do quite a few programs for Radio 3, and they've stopped taking them now. And we used to do quite a lot of short package segments for 5 Live, but now they've got their own science correspondent who want to do those in-house. And radios 1 and 2, if they do any science, they don't come to us to make it, I'm afraid. It's, this, in terms of, this is off the record as far as criticising the BBC is concerned and so on, which of course I'm not meant to do. But the BBC did have a very big structural shake-up under John Burt. We used to feel that we worked for whichever network I worked for, World Service, and my other science colleagues worked for Radio 4, and we felt that we were part of that network, and we would discuss with the schedulers the best way of doing science. John Burt divided it all up into separate cost units, so we are now no longer directly employed by World Service and Radio 4, and still less Radios 1 and Radio 2. We are like a big production company within the BBC, and we have to sell the programmes that we make to the networks, otherwise we can't pay the salary bill next year. So it's much more trying to offer them what they want rather than being part of the discussion process as to where the network should be going. And it's no use coming along to Radio 1 saying, hey, we can do you a really great pop science show. And you know, it's part of our job to do. It's no longer, we're not allowed to do that unless we basically charge them a lot of money for it, and they don't have money for buying in programs because it all goes on their celebrity DJs and so on in-house. It's just, we don't have that market.
So the BBC doesn't have a responsibility then, you think?
Oh, the BBC I'm sure does, but we are not. The Radio Science Unit is one tiny little business unit within the BBC and doesn't have say for the greater BBC. You need to put that question to, you know, managing director of radio or someone who does.
Okay, other questions? I have a question actually, Martin, about this whole thing of beliefs. Now, you picked up the notion of beliefs and the way that even the word itself has different kind of connotations to different people. Now, I would have thought, speaking as a scientist here, that, I mean, scientists have lots of beliefs, you know, scientific beliefs, and I wouldn't have any hesitation. I don't think most scientists have a hesitation in calling what they hold to as beliefs. You know, we believe that evolutionary biology is in fact the case, and we believe in Big Bang cosmology. You know? In other words, a whole sets of things that where the evidence seems pretty good and where one has those commitments to certain things, and we call those beliefs. So I find it quite curious that then the word belief, though, somehow has got this sort of negative connotation as we ought to have beliefs. It seems to me that a belief is simply something that you feel fairly confident about, you know, that, well, I believe it is going to rain this afternoon, you know, the predictions look pretty clear and very dark clouds, you know, I can hear the thunder. So, you know, your belief is fairly a well-founded belief. So it seems to me that belief can be used in a very kind of neutral way without this. Do you think that, in terms of the media, that it's now become, you know, kind of, got all these sort of other things attached to it, you know, these other feelings that beliefs are something one shouldn't have. It speaks of dogma, or it speaks of, you know, something like that. Is that
I think it tends to have those connotations in the context of religion, because, well, there are different ways of knowing, aren't there? There's knowing through the scientific method, through reproducing results, for gathering data, disproving a hypothesis, and so on. That will build up a body of belief, but a body of fairly objective belief. I think that's okay, but people, I don't think, tend to use the word belief for that, because belief has this connotation of being something that you don't need any evidence for, you just know it, as in perhaps a religious belief. I'm jealous of a lot of people here because you have religious beliefs. I wish I did.
Yeah,
I have religious hopes, but
I suppose I was thinking more of just the general use of the term within the scientific community, and you know, given that the word belief is used quite a lot, it seemed to be odd, you know, that it couldn't be used in other contexts, which for daily context might not.
Yeah.
Can I just come in on that point? Because I've been asked a couple of times by writers that I've edited, where I've put in the word belief, describing somebody's approach to their theory that they've done, you know, such and such believes that this is the answer. And the writer has actually said, I'd rather you didn't put in the word believe there, I'd rather use the word think, because I think it does have negative connotations. Yes. And people are allowed to think certain things, but they're not allowed to believe certain things, apparently. And I think it's because of the connotation of the word belief, it has a religious connotation. And I mean, it seems absolutely ridiculous to me, but and I continue to use it all the time. But I think there is a negative connotation with the word belief.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was mentioned earlier on that the teaching of science in schools, and there's a big difference between what scientists would call belief and how they approach science to how the lay public may perceive science. for them, they don't think science requires belief, where we would still look at evidence and say that, look, on this evidence I believe that this hypothesis is true. But for the public, they would place so much emphasis on science that it moves from belief to absolute fact. And maybe that's in the teaching at the school level. So hence for us, we can use belief. But for the public, belief becomes dogma. And you can't cross that line, you know? So, I mean, I think the emphasis needs to be on, you know, filtering down from the academic level what the scientific values truly are, you know? And then maybe we'll open up some of those challenges.
Yeah, I think you could very easily trigger another rant from me in that, because I actually think a lot of the fun of science is in the unknown, in the not head-on concussion arguments, but the discussion, the unknowns, the way people throw ideas about. And schools and even universities do tend to try and present science as a done deal, written in textbooks. You get it right or you get it wrong, don't argue. And all the fun is, or a lot of the fun is in the arguing, in the wondering, in the questing. And that's something that science journalism and radio in particular can do. They can tell the story and make you part of that quest, part of that journey. And that, I think, makes science a lot more exciting than if it's just read out from a textbook.
Am I allowed another one?
Yes,
could I possibly trigger a rant from you on pushing people to extreme positions in radio interviews? I did at one time a fair amount on GM food and GM crops on radio, and people would ring me up, the research assistant usually, and say, "What's your position on this?" And I would say, and they'd say, "Now can you tell me somebody who disagrees with you?" And I would say, I don't think there's anybody in the scientific community who disagrees with that particular view. This is what I've told you, is the view of 95% of the community. Well, who's in that 5%? Because we've got to have balance. And balance means two people putting two different views. Now, that's sometimes ridiculous. I've been paired with somebody from the Transcendental Meditation Society about GM, you see, and I was trying to be a technocrat, and the other person was having a very different view of the world around them. And but more than that, it forces the public perception that this debate is at extremes. And in fact, nearly all these debates, we and the scientific community are often in the middle. And looking back on the GM debate, everybody now says it was a mistake because it was just two extremes talking to each other. And I'm tempted to say that that's somewhat the fault of the media, who, not just the radio media, but the print media as well, who always are looking for contrasting positions because it makes good copy. Do you have a comment?
I think up to a point you're right. Well, I practice transcendental meditation, but it's all right. I don't think it has anything to say about GM whatsoever.
No, exactly. Exactly. He's a very nice man.
And I hope in the debate with the 5% guy, you were given 95% of the
No.
time. I'm afraid you have a real point in some context, particularly in, of course, not in our programmes, but sometimes even
in the Today programme,
more in
news
things
like
current affairs programmes,
Yeah.
partly because they are produced by people who are used to an adversarial system. They're used to politicians and getting balance that way, and they're not actually sufficiently au fait with the way science happens to treat it any differently. I think that's part of it.
Can I just follow that with continuing the rant? I feel very strongly about what Derek has just said. That both would be given the same time and both considered with the same seriousness. Yet, as Derek had said, on the other side, you would have great difficulty finding a scientist that is in the field who would take that view. And I came to the view that simply by engaging in that process, I'm giving these people legitimacy. So I stopped doing those things. there are other speakers that I would not go on the platform with, because you spend all of your time correcting their misinformation.
Yes.
You know, it's like a Gatling gun effect, where they'll come up with something a bit of misinformation, and you can painstakingly try and address that. And they say, oh, opinions vary on that. And they go to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And it's just hiding to nothing. It's kind of clearly a way to destroy a particular area of science.
I think you put your finger on it when you say you treat scientists as politicians. That this is a subject on which there are two perfect, I mean, I've got a lot of time for politicians, but this is a subject on which there are two perfectly reasonable points of view, either of which might be right, like views about nationalisation of railways or something, and it needs to be debated out. We don't actually solve problems of scientific uncertainty by debate in that way. We actually use something called evidence. And evidence has become very difficult to use on the radio because it's seen as authoritarian and judgmental. And it would say, I actually happen to know more about this than the other guy. But one is never allowed to say this. So I didn't know Phil had come to this point, but if I got to the point where they phoned me and said, I want somebody else. I said, there is nobody else, and I put the phone down. Because then I knew I killed the item on the radio. And because then they got to phone somebody else and fill the slot about something else.
I would encourage you to sort of make them turn the way they look at it around a little bit.
Well,
I mean,
all they're trying to do is fill airtime up, in my experience. I'm sorry, I'm very cynical about you guys.
It's often not a matter of opinion. The information is just plainly wrong.
Yeah.
So where people would say GM crops cause SARS. GM crops is responsible for the increase in allergenicity. No, just no evidence whatsoever.
Yeah.
You actually don't need evidence.
Yes,
All you need to do is to sow the seed of fear.
Yeah, and there are stories like that I have refused to run on World Service, like the guy who suggested that AIDS wasn't caused by HIV.
Yes.
I said we really must not even run that story to knock it, because there are going to be some people in Africa who will believe it and they will die because of your broadcast, so let's not do the broadcast. We didn't.
I think your attitude's unusual, Martin, and I'm glad you have that attitude.
Yes. But at the same time, science journalism isn't science education.
No.
And journalists aren't PR people. And as a science journalist, my main anxiety is we become science PR people too much. And we're expected to be science PR people. If we say anything that might be derogatory to science, I thought you were a science journalist. And can you imagine a political journalist who only said nice things about politics? They'd be out. And there's a challenge within it. It's journalism.
But there's a difference, and that's about evidence.
Yeah, I mean, good journalism still sticks with evidence. So, but it's not primarily there as an education medium.
I agree with that.
Martin? Yeah, just one quick other example to illustrate that. We haven't really mentioned intelligent design, which is, I think, a good case in point. And if anyone wants to look at this, I didn't want to take it away because it's my only copy, but there was a very good section all about intelligent design in the media in this that came out the same day as the results from the Dover trial. I did an article in it, but that was basically about the attitude in Britain, which is that it isn't really much of an issue. But because I don't think it's an issue at all in terms of evolution. If we have an item on evolution, I would not dream of having an intelligent design person on the discussion as well. But if we had an item about intelligent design as an issue that's churning up education in America or something, then that's a case where I want robust people to come in and pull it to shreds. So I wouldn't not do intelligent design. I just wouldn't put it on the same platform as an item about evolution.
Alison, sure, I think you had something. Yes.
Yeah, sure. I have some experience of working with journalists on the Star Wars area. in which there were quite a lot of demonstrations of weaponry technology that were supposedly revolutionary and supposedly successful. And these demonstrations were put on sometime in the early afternoon, and very spectacular, and all the press was invited. And because it was all such a big thing and story and so significant, the next morning's front pages would have, you know, demonstration of success of revolutionary new weapon, this great technological breakthrough, da-da-da-da-da. It was too much for me, and I finally lost my temper with the New York Times reporter who kept on being responsible for these things. And I said, look, I said, you get this stuff. Did you ever, and this was about adaptive optics, just to give it a little bit of flavor. I said, have you phoned an astronomer and asked them what the technology is capable of before you ran the story? Just to check it out, because I can tell you that whatever it is that you saw, it wasn't adaptive optics. Because I just happen to know enough about that kind of stuff. How dare you print these stories? And then a few days later say something about how, well, it wasn't actually that, we didn't quite understand it. You're just becoming a mouthpiece for a very politicized and irresponsible form of promotionalism for something that's actually not.
How dare the promoters put on the wool over all the journalists' eyes by pretending that it is.
Well, and of course his response was, well, they do it in the early afternoon. They know when our deadlines are. We can't possibly do this kind of thing. Our editors are breathing down our necks to have the story. They put it on the front page. It sells papers. But it's like, responsibility? Where? So the media are used all the time, and occasionally by irresponsible science. I mean, in the end, they didn't get away with it. He went back and he revisited them all. He published a feature article, admittedly not in the front page, not even in the front section, showing how each one of those things had been staged or misrepresenting what was going on, which kind of took some of the wind out of their sails. But it's hard to do that when you have a news agenda, when you have an editor. You do have space to fill. How do you respond to that when it's newsworthy?
Yeah. Well, I'm very lucky. I've moved into features now.
That's how you survived all those years at the BBC, eh?